Good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to be discussing the hack to running deep in poker tournaments. A lot of people think you should be weak and tight and wait for people to punt off their stacks. Other people think you should be loose and crazy and maniacal. Today, though, we're going to discuss specifically the number one hack to running deep in poker tournaments. First things first, are tournaments all luck? Every time I post on Twitter/X, people about how tournaments are skill, a lot of people say, oh, it's the luckiest player who wins every single time. They like to blame their lack of results on their lack of luck. And to be fair, luck does matter in the short run. If you play one tournament, odds are the luckiest player is going to win that tournament. But if you play 1,000 tournaments or 10,000 tournaments or 100,000 tournaments, odds are the best player is going to win more than their fair share. Essentially, when good players get lucky, they tend to win. When they get the top 10 distribution of hands out of the 100 players in the tournaments, they're going to make a really deep run. Bad players, though, they can get a great distribution of cards and still lose. You've seen this over and over and over again at the World Series of Poker main event. More often than not, a strong player ends up winning that tournament, despite the fact that only 15-ish% of the field are strong players. Also, if you look at the final table and that very deep stack structure, turns out when the weaker players get smashed by the deck, they still don't win. Sometimes they do. But quite often they end up taking second, third, fourth because, well, you can only be lucky for so long. Recognize that in the long run, the players who make the best decisions win in both poker and life. So, you have to learn to make better decisions than your opponents. Stop blaming bad results on bad luck. Instead, recognize that you must be accountable. I personally think you should feel as if you are overly accountable. For example, you don't have to play tournaments that have 10,000 players in them or 1,000 players in them. Right? You don't have to accept that variance. A lot of people think that they have to play every single game that comes on their radar, or every game that is at their local casino, or every game that their friends are playing. Recognize that you get to choose when you play. If you don't like variance, play games with less variance. Duh, go play chess. Go play full ring cash games, etc., etc. Right? You need to make a point to recognize what you can control. And one thing that you do get to control is when to play. That said, variance is fine. Learn to embrace it. Obviously, to win at poker, I've just said this a billion times, you have to do three things. You have to find a game you can beat, play it a lot, and keep a proper bankroll. If you do those three things, you will win. If you do not, you will lose. To recap, find a game you can beat, play it a lot, keep a proper bankroll. Period. Finding a game you can beat implies you make better decisions than your opponents. Love the needle at cash games. No needle at cash games. Just recognize that you're going to have less variance in cash games. I think cash games are a great way to build your bankroll initially because there's way less variance, right? Whenever you're starting off with almost no money, well, you don't really want variance. You want to slowly grind it up. You can accept more variance as your bankroll gets bigger and bigger. For example, for 1,000 player poker tournaments, you may need 300 buy-ins in your bankroll or more. That's a lot. A lot of people don't like that. What do you think are softer, live tournaments or live cash games? They're both soft. Probably live cash games in general, though, because when live cash games run, especially at the high stakes, it's usually because the game is very, very good. How'd I do in Vegas last time? I honestly played relatively few poker tournaments last time, and I lost them all. Oh no, 0 for 4 or whatever. LOL. Some of you are playing on Coin Poker right now. Check it out. We have a weekly tournament at pokercoaching.com/weeklymtt. You also get a nice deposit bonus, good rakeback, etc., etc., etc. Are you a pro? Feel free to Google Jonathan Little Poker. He'll tell you all about me. So, should you play tight or loose in tournaments? Well, A tight strategy is excellent against horrible, loose, splashy opponents. If your opponents are going to be loose and splashy and just get all their money in with any pair, play tight. Poker's easy when your opponents are terrible. A lot of people like to say things like, my opponents are so splashy, they get lucky on me. Cry, 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 complain, complain, complain. You want them playing bad hands. If your opponents are playing the Jack 4 and the 69, and you're playing the aces and the kings, yeah, you're going to lose about 15% of the time, give or take. If you're against 3 players, you're going to lose 40% of the time, give or take, but you're getting great odds, right? And you're far ahead. If you're not happy with those odds, poker is not for you. A loose strategy is excellent against horrible, weak, tight opponents. You can be both horrible in a loose, splashy way and a weak, tight way. If your opponents are going to drastically overfold on all betting rounds, you should be loose and aggressive. You should be trying to win all the small pots where it's clear no one wants to win the pot. And when it's clear they do want to win the pot, you need to get out of the way. That said, against competent players, you should generally strive to play somewhat close to GTO, taking advantage of the things that players generally do wrong. T-Op86. Peak GTO has changed your poker career. You're plus $50,000 in March alone. Nice work. Recognize, to run deep in poker tournaments, you must accumulate chips. You can't just sit there and play tight. Now, sometimes you will be card dead and forced to fold a lot. If I had to guess, maybe 15% of the time or 25% of the time, something like that in poker tournaments that I, Jonathan Little, play, I sit down and never get above a starting stack, or barely get above a starting stack. You simply just don't get hands. Or you get hands and you lose with them. That is okay. Sometimes you're going to lose. That is part of life. Get used to it. Usually, though, you can find many spots for open raises and 3-bets, especially if you're playing good, strong, reasonable GTO poker. We're going to take a look at what that looks like in just a minute using peak GTO. Also, you generally need to give action in order to get action. Most of the time, you're not going to be against horrible, loose, splashy opponents who are going to be oblivious to the fact that you're sitting there folding every hand. So, you have to get in there and battle a little bit. So, you have to accumulate chips. We're going to give you some examples of that in just a minute. That said, you need to accumulate chips while also minimizing risk. You need to avoid going broke when the cost is minimal, meaning you want to avoid substantial risks that make almost no profit. A lot of bluffs in the game theory optimal strategy make almost no money or no money. No money. A lot of the value bets that the GTO strategy will make almost no money. So, especially when you're risking a lot of your stack, you want to make sure the plays you're making are decently profitable. Now, that doesn't mean you should be like Phil Hellmuth and try to fold pocket aces before the flop early in a poker tournament. Don't do that. 80% is great. You should be happy to get your money in with 80% in almost all scenarios. That said, you do want to avoid substantial risk when the profit is going to be minimal, even if the game theory optimal strategy says value bet it or bluff it. No. Survival is important in poker tournaments because as you get deeper in the tournament, you're closer and closer to getting in the money, and that forces you to try to get in the money. In general, when you are playing in a poker tournament, you want to be leaning and applying pressure onto the shorter stacks. You want to be making lots of little bets that force their stack to go into the pot, because that forces them to be at risk and that forces them to overfold. That said, against deeper stacks, especially as you get later in the tournament, you're usually going to want to be playing far more cautiously. You can see this if you study looking at game theory optimal strategies at the final table or near the bubble. Very often, when you are the shorter stack and you really don't want to go broke, you do a whole lot of checking. Okay? That said, GTO is not tight. I think if anything, a lot of players in tournaments skew a little bit too passive. I do realize some of you are maniacs out there. And if that's the case, well, you're probably already bluffing too much. But a lot of players simply do not bluff often enough in tournaments. They play way too weak, tight, straightforward, and only put the money in when they think they are going to win the pot. Every single time. But that is far too often to win. You should not only be value betting when you have the nuts, and you should not only be bluffing when you have the absolute perfect bluffing candidate. You got to get out of line sometimes, but recognize out of line, in quotes, is game theory optimal approved. So you need to make a point to study what good, strong game theory optimal poker looks like, and we're going to be studying today using Peak GTO. I've been helping everyone for free, and I deserve some likes. Well, thank you. If you enjoy the show, click the like button, click the subscribe button, check out the other videos. You kind of like ace queen in a 3-bet pot. Sure. What happens when all of these guys go only ace X in pairs? If your opponents play every ace X, you're going to smash them. Ace X offsuit in early position is a very bad hand. Small pairs in early position are a very bad hand. So if your opponents are playing poorly, that's great. You'll absolutely demolish them. Also, if you know their range is only ace X in pairs, any board without an ace is bad for them, right? Recognize that when you give your opponent a very simplistic strategy, that's just not accurate, because they're going to play the Jack-10 suited and the King-Queen, right? They're not only playing ace-X in pairs. Let's take a look at some spots where maybe you all are messing up. Today, we're going to look at, let's say, 40 big blinds deep. This is Peak GTO. Check it out at peakgto.com. We have a great trainer, lots of spots in the library, and lots of new stuff being added every day. We're actually going to be pushing out a big update very, very soon with lots more reports and more sims. Let's take a look at this spot, though. Here we are, under the gun, in a tournament, 8-handed, 40 big blinds deep. Take a look at this. This is what you should raise from first position. This is about 18% of hands. Notice we are not raising ace-2 suited, jack-8 suited, 8-7 suited, pocket 2s, pocket 3s all that often, ace-9 offsuit, queen-10 offsuit, and jack-10 offsuit. This chart presumes everyone yet to act plays perfectly. So ask yourself, do your opponents play perfectly? I would venture to say that most of your opponents do not play perfectly. Even in the highest stakes games, most players are not going to play perfectly. Also, this chart presumes everybody has 40 big blinds. This also presumes we are not anywhere near the money at all. Okay, what if instead we had 50 big blinds, everybody else had 40, and half of the players remained in the tournament? Well, now we're getting a little bit close to the money. Not really, but a little bit. Also, you have more chips than your opponent, so you can apply pressure to them, right? So this is a great spot to raise wider. Also, in general, people do not call or re-raise often enough. For example, if you raise here, look at how the player on the button should play. They should call king-6 suited, king-5 suited, 5-4 suited, some queen-jack offsuit. They should be 3-betting, jack-8 suited, ace-8 suited, king-jack offsuit, ace-10 offsuit. A lot of players don't do this. So if this player plays too tightly because they don't call some of the weaker hands and they don't 3-bet the bluffs, that lets you, all the way over here under the gun, raise a little bit wider. So what does wider mean? In this spot, I would raise ace-2 suited. Really all the hands that are using a mixed strategy, queen-jack, king-10, 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, 4s, 3s, 2s, maybe jack-8 suited, maybe 7-6 suited, maybe 6-5 suited. And that allows you to raise even a little bit wider than GTO recommends. And this is going to be the case for all positions. Most players in most spots don't 3-bet or call quite often enough. For example, let's say they fold to you in the cutoff. Take a look at what you should raise. This is about 38% of hands, 40 big blinds deep. Okay? But look at what happens if you raise. Here's how the button should respond. They should be 3-betting, king-7 suited, queen-8 suited, 9-7 suited, a lot. Jack-10 offsuit, queen-10 offsuit, ace-8 offsuit. A lot of players just don't do this. They either call or fold. They also don't call the king-6 suited, king-5 suited, king-4 suited, right? You don't think you've ever raised king-8 suited under the gun. Well, good, tidy. You just got a whole lot better at poker. Turns out if you study poker for just a minute, if you've never done it before, you will get far better at poker. So look at what the player and the button is supposed to be 3-betting if the cutoff raises. The cutoff is the player to the right of the button. If they don't do this, if they skew tighter or just not as aggressive, meaning they don't 3-bet all these bluffs, well, then you get to raise wider. So what would wider be for the cutoff? Well, take all the hands that are mixing, there aren't that many, I know, and raise those, and then also raise hands that are on the cusp of playability, like queen-3 suited, queen-2 suited, 9-6 suited, 7-5 suited, 6-4 suited, 4-3 suited, any ace-X offsuit, king-8, king-7, queen-8, 9-8, 8-7 offsuit. All of that. This is a spot where you should be raising far wider because the player on the button's not going to 3-bet often enough. What about the player in the small blind? Notice again, they should be calling King 4 suited, King 5 suited, King 6 suited, Queen 7 suited. Nobody does this. Right? They should be calling decently wide in the small blind. And they don't. So that also lets you raise the cutoff wider. Notice they should also be ripping it in for 40 big blinds. Most people don't do that. Most people don't 3-bet the King 8 suited, or the pocket 6s, or the Jack 10 offsuit, or the Ace 8 offsuit. Most players are too tight in the small blind. Look at the big blind. Most players in the big blind do call all the suited hands. They do call lots of the offsuit stuff, but they also miss a lot of these bluffs. Most players in the big blind don't 3-bet any of this offsuit stuff. I personally like the King 8 offsuit, and the Queen 8 offsuit, and the Queen 9 offsuit, and the Ace 5 offsuit. These are very, very nice spots to put in the bluff. Perhaps exploitatively more than GTO recommends. By the way, when they do make it 2.3, make it 9.2. With all the best hands, of course, you're getting them in. And then if your opponent does go all in, you fold the garbage, right? Easy. You only call it off with the good hands. Okay? This is a spot where a lot of people also do not play well. So again, if your opponents do not play well, you in turn get to raise wider. Okay? So everyone who's saying, oh, I was just card dead pre-flop, well, you were probably looking down at the King 7 and the 9-8 and the 8-7 and the Jack 5 suited and the 9-6 suited and the 7-5 suited in the cutoff and just mucking them every time, not realizing you could exploitatively play them. Why Jack 8 seems like a spew? Well, why do you think? Say you raise small blind fools. What are you referring to here? Jack 8, Jack 9, Queen 9, Queen 8, King 8, all of these are reasonable bluffs. Why? They have blockers. Offsuit blockers are very good out of position because your opponent's going to be shoving or folding a decent chunk of the time. You feel like GTO is too high level against players you play against. GTO is good against all players. That's the power of GTO. It does not matter what your opponents do. You will either break even or win if they play GTO poker. If you play GTO poker. If they do anything besides play perfectly against you, you will you will win on average. Now, of course, if your opponents do something obviously wrong, you should exploit them. I literally just went through how to play from the cutoff exploitatively. I just went through this. I did not say to play this chart. Where is it? It's over there. I did not say to play this chart. I said to play wider than this chart. Why? Because the players yet to act usually will be too tight. What if they'll be too loose and they'll re-raise more often? Well, fold the bottom of the range, right? Because you can't defend the bottom of the range. Use some common sense, everyone. Always make a point to exploit the mistakes your opponents make. That said, I do think a lot of players think they know what their opponents are doing far better than they actually do. So many poker players are overly egotistical. And they think they know what their opponents do wrong. Hate to break it to you, very often you will not know what your opponents do wrong. If you've watched me play the cash game streams on Coin Poker recently, you will see many scenarios where I'm like, oh, this feels like a spot where the bluff's not going to get through. But it's just an obvious GTO bluff. So you know what? I do it. You know what? More often than not, it works out. And there'll be other spots where, I mean, look, there are a lot of spots where I, Jonathan Little, a pretty decent poker player, have ideas of what's happening, but I don't necessarily trust them 100%. Falling back on GTO is very, very powerful because you can't screw it up. Well, you can't screw it up if you don't know what you're doing, but if you know what you're doing and you know roughly what GTO looks like, you will crush your opponents no matter what they do. You make it 2, how much do you re-raise? It says very clearly right up here at the top. If you make it 2, button makes it 6.9 if you want to 3-bet. If you make it 2.3, and from out of position, here we're going 8.1, and in the big blind we're going 9.2. Okay. So exploitatively, in general, I think you should raise a little bit wider. Now, what I want to do is let's say it folds us in the cutoff and we raise. The button folds, the small blind folds, and the big blind calls. Let's put a flop out there. Let's make the flop good for the cutoff and bad for the big blind. What is a flop that's good for the cutoff and bad for the big blind? Let's do king, queen, 4. Big blind has to check everything. Why do they have to check everything here? Well, it's because their equity is very low, only 40%. 40% is very bad. Why is their equity very bad? Because they're missing all the best hands. And all the best hands connect pretty well with the king and the queen. Also, the cutoff would have raised all the best hands, right? We also have a nice update coming to peak very soon. They'll let you go backwards very easily. So they have to check every time. You'll find that very often, the player in the big blind has to check very frequently, especially when stacks are deep. As they get shallower and shallower, you do get to have some leads, but not on the king, queen, 4. All right, big blind checks. This is a spot where the player in the cutoff should bet very frequently. Notice they should bet 85% of the time, usually for a small size. They do have some big bets. You're going to find your big bets usually come from your hands that are almost always good but vulnerable. That's going to be aces and ace-king primarily here. And then some draws, mainly junky ones, because your opponent's not going to want to raise into a range that contains a lot of aces and ace-king. Notice here aces and ace-king are betting big very often. Then we have Jack 10, Jack 9, 10 9 for gut shots and open-ended, and ace 2 and ace 3 suited with backdoor draws, although it looks like it goes without the backdoor draw sometimes too. Standard stuff. We're not going to get into this too much, but you can learn all about it at pokercoaching.com in the tournament and cash game master classes. This is very, very, very clearly explained there over and over and over again. You need to get used to these situations. Now, exploitatively, how should you adjust this strategy if, let's say, your opponent folds a little too often and doesn't raise often enough? How should you adjust this strategy? Fred, this is at peakgto.com. It is a web-based program. You do not download it. How should you adjust this strategy if your opponent will not raise often enough and will fold a little too often? By the way, just to show, if you do bet small here, 1.5 big blinds only, 1.5, here's what your opponent should do. They should raise a lot of kings. They should raise a lot of Jack 10, Jack 9, 10 9. They should raise a lot of junkers, like Jack 3 suited, Jack 2 suited, 10 3 suited, 10 2 suited, 5 3 suited, 4 2 suited, 3 2 suited, 4 3 suited. I don't think a lot of people are raising these hands, at least not in my experience against a small bet. Notice they should also call stuff like ace high backdoor flush draw, jack high backdoor flush draw, 10 high backdoor flush draw. You think your opponents are doing that? I don't think they are. So even against a tiny bet, I think people are folding too often. Notice, against a tiny bet, they should fold 41%. I would venture to say they fold more like 50%. And also, they should be raising about 20% or 19%. And I think most people don't raise anywhere near that amount either. I don't think they raise a lot of the King X. I don't think they raise a lot of these junkers. So, how should that change your strategy? Well, going back here, instead of betting small 80% of the time, you should bet small every time. 100%. Good, standard stuff. This is how you go about accumulating chips in tournaments. Now, if you are in your opponent's shoes, and you check the flop, and they bet small, with everything, how should you adjust your strategy? We now want to consider how the big blind should play here. We call pre-flop with a GTO range. We check the flop, they bet small 100% of the time. You know that's what they do here. How should you respond? Where can you study more about the positions and amounts you should be betting? I mean, it's very clearly listed in Peak. To be fair, you can raise a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger. That will force you to be either a little bit tighter or wider. It's somewhat arbitrary. In general, though, you want to raise smaller as stacks are shallower because you don't need to make the pot bigger early to get all the money in late. What should the player in the big blind do if the player continuation bets every time and small from the cutoff? If you are enjoying today's show, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button, click the notification bell, tell your friends. Welcome to all 500 of you who are here. I know it's bright and early, but here we are. No one has an answer, or maybe my program is broken. I'll tell you, if your opponent continuation bets too frequently, it's not as easy as raise more often. It's also not as easy as call more often. You should actually raise more often on boards that are good for your range. And you should call more often on boards that are bad for your range. Why? Because when you raise on this king, queen, 4 board, you are raising into a lot of aces, kings, queens, ace, king, queen, king, jack, king 10, king 9, all king X, right? So while you will perhaps raise a little bit more often, you're actually just going to do more calling here. Feels gross though. Take a look at what you need to stick around with. All these hands that are mixing between calls and folds will call. 10-6 of hearts, for example, will call. Feels kind of nasty, doesn't it? But that is what you should be doing if your opponent is continuation betting too frequently on a board that is good for their range. Now, here you perhaps could get away with raising more king X and raising some of these junkers down here. But notice you're not even raising like jack 7 of hearts very often to begin with, right? You're mostly calling or folding. But all these mixes will become calls. Notice like ace 5 of spades calls, whereas like jack 5 of spades always folds. Recognize that with jack 5 of hearts, clubs, and diamonds, you'll call, but with all the ace 5, you'll call, okay? Is peak GTO free? No. Believe it or not, we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars making this program for all of you. We need to recoup some of that money. You can check it out, though. Some of it's free. What should you do against a player who likes to trap and just call the strong hands that hit the flop? Well, what do you think? Use some common sense. If your opponent's range is too strong, going to the turn, let's say, because they don't raise any king X. Let's say they don't raise king X or queen 4. They call instead. That should make you bet the turn far less often, especially with your bluffs. Anytime anyone's range is far too strong for whatever reason, you bluff less often. And you value bet less often. This comes up a lot of the time on the river when someone should have an all-in range, but let's say on the river your opponent should have like a 2x pot all-in, and then something like a half pot and a full pot bet. GTO uses all of them, which it often will. If your opponent never 2x pots all-in though, and instead they pot all of those hands, you should bluff against their pot size bet way less often, because their range is going to be far stronger, right? Always use common sense and think about, if my opponent's range changes, how does it change? If it got stronger, bluff less often and value bet less thinly. If it got weaker, bluff more often and value bet thinner, right? So anyway, in this spot, all these mixes are going to become continues, either by raising or calling. Perhaps even some of these, like ace 5. I mean, ace 5 feels pretty junky here. Ace 8 feels pretty junky. Really, all the ace X feels pretty junky, but you probably want to stick around against someone who continuation bets every single time small. What if instead the flop was different? Say it was 7, 6, 5. Now the big blind's going to have a lot of leads. Why does the big blind have a lot of leads here? Well, their equity is now 50%, and on top of that, they have far more nuts in their range than the cutoff. Notice they have lots of 8-7 and 4-3 suited. They have lots of random 2 pairs like 7-6, 6-5, etc. So now this is a spot where the big blind gets to lead. First things first, most people in most games simply don't lead. They check everything here. This is a good example of what we were just talking about. Say the big blind checks everything in this spot, instead of leading about half the time, 44%. How should that change your strategy in the cutoff? Take a second, think about it. If the big blind doesn't lead, and their leading range will be a lot of good stuff, right? It's a lot of hands with straight draws, top pairs, middle pairs, bottom pairs, overcards with equity. Not a whole lot of total junk like the queen 2 or the jack 2 or the 10-2. You have a little bit of junk here with the 9-2, but these are backdoor draws. If they don't lead appropriately, how should that change your range? Louis Philippe nailed it. Why would you check when there's 3 to a straight and it smashes your range? Well, notice you should check 55%. Don't think you should just always lead. Maybe you should always lead against some people. We'll talk about that in just a second. But assuming your opponent doesn't play GTO right off the bat on the flop in the big blind and they check everything, you should bet far less often on the button compared to whatever GTO says, or on the cutoff compared to whatever GTO says, because your opponent's range is stronger than it should be in quotation marks. Now you can go through and you can node lock this and say my opponent checks every time and you'll see how far you should adjust, but we can use a little bit of common sense. Say your opponent checks. Here's what the cutoff should do. They should be betting only half the time to begin with. Only half the time to begin with. They're going to be betting less often if the opponent's range is stronger. So what is betting already? Overpairs makes a lot of sense. Top pairs makes a lot of sense. Pairs and draws makes sense. Some eights, some nines, and a few junkers. You're going to want to bluff less often with the hands that really don't want to get raised. That's going to be some nines. It's going to be some junkers. Maybe some middle pairs that are betting some small frequency like, queen five of hearts, stuff like that. But you are going to be checking a little bit more often. Okay? When your opponent's range is stronger, bet less often. Now, let's go back to here. Say you do lead here. Look at how the player on the button should continue. Actually, I want you to take a second and think about it. How often should the player on the button fold if you bet 1.5 big blinds? By the way, when you do lead from the big blind, you're almost always going to lead tiny because we are just nudging a little bit of money in the pot with our favorable portion of our range on average. We're not humongously favored in this spot. We only have 50% equity. So in this spot, how often should the player in the cutoff fold? Roughly. You just need to know this kind of thing roughly. Recognize the opponent in the cutoff is going to be getting really, really good pot odds. When they're getting really, really good pot odds, they have to stick around a lot. Tidy says they should basically never fold. Well, that's not right. You should fold some. Anytime you face a bet, you should fold out the bottom portion-ish of your range. When you run deep in a tournament, you have to make several big folds. I would venture to say the opposite. When you run deep in tournaments, you have to make several big calls. Making big folds is usually not how you win. You got to recognize, quote unquote, running deep is not really the goal. The goal is to win the tournament / maximize your equity. And going around making big folds is very often not ideal. That's a good way to survive, but without a whole lot of chips. Now, if you're saying there's like 4 to a straight on the board and you have a set, yeah, obviously, okay. But if there's 3 to a straight on the board and you have a set, you're probably not trying to fold. There are plenty of times, though, when it becomes very clear your opponent loves their hand and you have to make a fold. But let's say right here, say your opponent leads 1.5 big blinds and you call with a pair, you're not really trying to fold on the turn unless your opponent is making some mistake. So in this spot, say the opponent does bet small, 1.5 big blinds. Notice you're going to fold about 10 to 15% of the time. Yeah, 10% of the time. Now, is 10% of the time basically never? Maybe it is basically never. Maybe Tidy got it right. But you are still folding some. Notice ace-king folds some. I would probably not fold the ace-king here, but king, queen, king, jack, queen, jack, king 10, queen 10, offsuits, all seem like okay folds. That said, even then, some of them mix. So, very importantly, if your opponent folds every king, queen, king, jack, king 10, queen 10, if they fold every single time with that, and they fold with, let's say, ace 2 and king 2 every time with or without a backdoor draw, maybe they fold king 2 every time. What else may they fold? Ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, ace 10. They may fold those. If your opponent folds all of those, how should that change your strategy in the big blind? Take a second. Think about it. By the way, all these folds that are mixing are basically neutral. All of these are essentially neutral, okay? And in this spot, because the bet is so small and we're in position and all of our overcards have some equity, you got to stick around pretty wide. If they are going to be folding, though, with all their king, queen, jack, queen 10, etc., you should be leading every single time because they're making a mistake. Always consider the mistakes your opponents are likely to make. Louis Philippe says you should lead with your entire range if they overfold by 4% or more. Don't know the exact math, but yes, sounds about right. So say you do lead and they call. And say the turn is a jack, offsuit jack. You still get to keep betting a lot. Why do you get to keep betting a lot in the big blind? Well, because they just have a whole lot of unpaired high cards that can't really continue all that well. Notice in this spot we have two sizes that are being used. Maybe you only want to use 25% pot or a third pot exploitatively. But in general, if you take a look at what is betting using the bigger size, it's going to be your best made hands that are vulnerable. It's going to be some jacks, some sevens, right? And then some junkers like 8s and 9s and 4s. So you either have a pretty good made hand like a jack or a 7, which is great, or some sort of bluff that usually has some equity. Anyway, say you bet again on the turn small. We bet small on the flop and got called by almost everything. Say we bet small on the turn. Will your opponent stick around now? Notice what should stick around now. All ace king and ace queen should stick around. King queen should call a lot. All the 9s should call. A lot of people start folding out a gut shot here. Ace 10 calls every time. Pocket 2s calls some, right? So if your opponent is, again, folding too often, how should that change your turn strategy in the big blind? Well, if they're going to fold too often, you should keep betting. You should be betting more often than this. Maybe, not going to say 100% of the time because we are checking here a lot, but you should keep betting very, very often. Notice when you bet bigger, your opponent should start making more folds. I think when you bet big, take a look at this. I think people play pretty well against a big bet here. They should fold ace king and they will. They should fold king queen and they will. They should fold random hands with a 10, and they will, right? They should maybe even fold some 9s, and a lot of people will. So if your opponent's going to play well against a big bet, maybe that's not a great size, right? Always consider which size your opponent will play poorly against. In this scenario, do we have any bigger bets? Not really, so you don't want to look at that. Whenever you are looking at GTO sims, you may say, oh, what if I pot it? But you have to realize the sim presumes you're potting it with a potting range, which is almost no hands. Right? Therefore, you don't really want to look at that. So anyway, in this spot, I think a 6.1 bet is not particularly great exploitatively, but I do think the small bet is great because I think a lot of people fold out a little bit too often. And if your opponents just fold out a little bit too often, that's great. Also, I think a lot of people don't raise nearly often enough. Take a look at this. When you make it 2.3, they should be raising 29% of the time to 12 big blinds. 29. That's a lot. Take a look at this. They should be raising a lot of jacks, a lot of overpairs, and then a lot of draws, mainly with 8s and 9s and 4s, right? Guess we have the ace 3 sneaking in there too. I don't think many people raise nearly as often. So if your opponent's going to, number one, fold a little bit too often, and number two, not raise often enough, that lets you bet again in the big blind very, very often. So say you do bet, and they call. Now, beware, if they call and we think they're folding a little bit, here's another quiz. We'll make another quiz. Type the answer in the comment section, in the chat down there. If you think your opponents are going to fold the turn a little bit too often and not raise the turn often enough, how should that change the big blind's river strategy? We think the opponent's going to be a little bit too tight on the flop, and we think they're going to be a little bit too tight on the turn when we bet small on both betting rounds. How should that change our river strategy? Are you getting priced in with your gut shots, or is it worth it because of nut advantage? Not really sure what you mean, but you're in position facing a small bet. In position facing a small bet, you got to call a lot, assuming your opponent is playing reasonable. What kind of reads you think you can observe? Recognize, Thomas, you don't necessarily have to observe anything to know what your opponents do wrong. Most players in most games don't call the king-queen or the ace-10 or even the ace-queen when you bet the flop and the turn. They just fold. How do we know that? Well, I've played poker for only 20 years, and I've seen it over and over and over and over again. Are we assuming they're still too tight on the river? We're going to take a look, aren't we? If the opponent's range is too strong going to the river, for whatever reason, we're going to bluff less often. And we're also going to value bet a little bit tighter. Also, if we go back over here, Look to avoid substantial risks that make almost no profit. A lot of your thin value bets and bluffs make no profit, or effectively no profit. And that's going to force you to give up with them. So let's say you do bet turn and they call, and let's say the river's a brick like a 2. Take a look at what you should do. You're going to do a lot of betting. A lot of betting. In GTO world. Notice we have pot, 2/3 pot, 25% pot. Like I said, usually going to be using a bunch of different bet sizes. Pot's 13 big blinds here, by the way. It says it right here. Can someone explain nut advantage to you like you're an idiot? Yeah. Which player's range contains more effective nut hands? In this spot on 765, the big blind has 4-3 suited, 9-8 offsuit, all these 2 pairs, and the cutoff does not, because they would have folded those. Is all this applicable to cash games? Most definitely. Check out the cash game masterclass at pokercoaching.com. So now, in the spot, let's say we 2/3 pot it. That's our most common bet size. Does the opponent play this way? This is what you want to ask yourself when you're playing. Does my opponent do this when I 2/3 pot it on the river? Are they tighter or are they looser? Recognizing, though, they may have more good hands in their range because they're not raising the turn often enough. So, do they call basically every pair? What do you think? If you give your opponent ace-5, king-5, queen-5, queen-6, etc., ace-king even sometimes, do they call all of these? Recognize this is not 100% accurate because this presumes we have a 2/3 pot range that is the same as GTO. Our range will be a little bit different. If it's wider, they should, of course, call wider. If we have more bluffs, they should, of course, call wider. I would venture to say, though, when you bet small on the flop, small on the turn, and then 2/3 pot on the river, a lot of people with bottom pair fold. A lot of people with pocket 3s fold. A lot of people with ace-king, an ace-8, an ace-9 fold. So that makes that bet size perhaps quite nice. What if instead we 25% potted it? Will they do this? Will they call almost every ace high? Will they raise almost any jack? I don't know. I think a lot of people may fold out ace high here on the river when you bet small. Maybe that's a pretty sweet bet size. Now, if they call literally any ace high, literally any king high, and they bluff raise more often against the small bet, well, then perhaps that's not so ideal, right? You always want to consider, what does the opponent do incorrectly? Or different than GTO. In this spot, though, I think aggression is really nice. Because I think for both the small size and the medium size, people fold too often. What about if you pot it? Now, they should fold out a lot of bottom pairs and a lot of middle pairs. I do think that when you pot it on the river, most players will fold out bottom pair and middle pair. Seems reasonable to me. For that reason, I don't think the big bet's especially good in this spot. You're going to find that in general, as you bet bigger and bigger, a lot of people play okay. They usually take their 7s and they call. And they'll take some 6s and call, and they'll call all the jacks. And they'll fold pretty much everything else. And notice, they should be folding almost everything else. So that's not good for you. Against the pot size bet, your opponent's going to play pretty reasonably. Take a look at this also. Notice, with a hand like Jack 10, they should go all in. Same thing with Queen Jack, King Jack, aces, kings, obviously. Plus a few little bluffs. Let's go back to over here. Look to avoid going broke when the cost is minimal, / avoid substantial risks that make almost no profit. Any hand that's mixing between shove and call, like Jack 10, see it's roughly 50-50 between shove and call. These hands should basically always be called. And if you're not shoving these, you have to bluff a little bit less often too. Notice there aren't a whole lot of bluffs to begin with. All these are bluffs, but it's tiny, tiny, tiny smidgens. So in this spot, Jack 10 and probably Queen Jack should not be pushed all in. In my opinion, whenever you are in the middle or late stages of the tournament. Because if you call and lose, yeah, you're losing a chunky pot. You have, what, 30 big blinds left or something like that? Or 20 big blinds left? But 20 big blinds left is quite nice. What's their strategy if your hand is 9-9? You don't have 9-9. Notice there are no 9s here. Why are there no 9s here? Because on the flop, where's the flop? On the flop, when they bet small, you raise 9s every time. Your best top pairs and the weakest over pairs raise very, very frequently against small leads or against bets in general. Okay? So, notice throughout this spot, we've talked about a whole lot of exploits. All of these exploits will help you accumulate chips. Also, a lot of these exploits will result in you sticking around, especially when your opponents use small bets. As your opponents use small bets, you should be sticking around very, very frequently. Large bet sizes at your stakes are super based towards value anyway. Well, again, if your opponents, when they bet big, just have it, overfold. Poker's easy whenever your opponents take one bet size and have far too many strong and or weak hands in that range, right? Makes your life easy. How's the strategy change when playing against people who are shoving a lot of junk? What do you mean by shoving a lot of junk? Well, call more, obviously. Give you an example. Let's say we're at the end of the re-entry period. We have 20 big blinds. Everyone folds to you in the cutoff, and you raise, and you think the button's going to go all in with any two cards. 100% of hands. Oops. This is what the button should go all in with. But you think your opponents can go all in with anything. Now, wiggy-tozzy. A lot of people think my opponents are shoving a lot of junk, and they think that means anything. Everyone's not shoving anything here. Most of your opponents have half of a brain and know that the 69 offsuit and the Jack 4 offsuit and the 10-2 offsuit and the 7-2 offsuit are not good hands to go all in with, even at the end of the re-entry period, even if they have a third of a starting stack. It's just not a good play. It's losing a lot of money. Now, some of your opponents will be that bad, and if they are, congrats, you're going to win a bunch of money. But most people aren't that bad. If anything, most people shove a little bit too wide. They may take all ace-x suited, and maybe a few more ace-x offsuits, and maybe some suited connectors or Jack 10 offsuit or something like that and shove. Say they do shove all in for 20 big blinds back to you in the cutoff. Here's what you should normally call with. How would you adjust? You would widen your calling range a little bit. You can actually use paper and pen to figure out how often you should call in this situation. There's also a program called Equilab. Poker Strategy Equilab. I will show you how to use this. This is a free program. You can just search it up real quick. Poker Strategy Equilab. You give your opponent a range. Let's say you think they're going to shove this. Who knows what they actually shove? I don't know what your opponents are going to actually shove, but let's say you think because it's at the end of the re-entry period, they're going to go nuts. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Again, this is up for you to decide. Maybe you think they're shoving everything they're going to play. Who knows? Let's just make it easy and do that. Do you think they're shoving any ace, any suited connector, or king 9, queen 9, jack 9, king 8? Sure. We think they're going bonkers. This is pretty bonkers in my opinion. Now, assuming it's the end of the re-entry period, it means you're not really so close to getting in the money yet. Maybe a little, but not so much. Here you have to put in how much? You have to put in 18 to try to win how much? You're 20, your opponent's 20, and then 2.5-ish from the blinds and antes. So that's 42.5. 18 divided by 42.5 equals. This means we need to have 42% to break even. So let's say we need to have 43% to profit. Because again, there are no payout implications really. So you go to Tools, Hand Range Calculator, type in 43%, calculate hand range, and here is what you should call with. Boom. There you go. There you have it. Nice and easy. That's the answer. You should call with all of that. What if you want to have a little bit more equity because you're not so sure in your assessment that your opponent is horrible? What if you're not so sure they're horrible and shoving far too wide? Well, now maybe you want to have like, I don't know, 45% to account for that, which is a pretty reasonable edge. Oops, I did this wrong. You have to remove this range. Tools, Hand Range Calculator, 45. Now you should call with this, which is a little bit tighter. Not a whole lot tighter, though, mind you, but a little bit tighter. Okay? Now, again, this is basic rough math. This is a cool feature. I mean, it is a cool feature, but recognize this is a very simplistic short stack spot that we were talking about. Most of the time, you're not going to be dealing with very simplistic short stack spots because your opponent's not going to do this. They're not going to be so bad that they just rip it in with all this junk, because they're going to re-raise small with some stuff like these, right? So maybe these are not in their range. Maybe these are not in their range. Maybe they call some of this stuff or re-raise it differently. Who knows, right? Also, you have to account for players yet to act. I realize in this overly simplistic spot I gave you, there are no players yet to act. But maybe their range is actually this instead. Notice we just made their range weaker, because maybe they re-raise small with the best hands, right? So now, tools, hand range calculator, we needed 43 to begin with, right? Calculate hand range, take the main window. But again, you're going to see it's all pretty much the same stuff, plus or minus some pips, right? But notice here, king 9 offsuit, queen 10 offsuit, king 10 offsuit, 10-9 suited, call it off for 18 more big blinds. But that's because you presume your opponent's making a big mistake. You can't remember the details for the GTO flowcharts. Well, I recommend you study. When should you overbet? For value or bluff? Is it more blocker dependent or something else? You want to be betting huge when you have lots of nuts in your range. This is typically when you are the aggressor on the previous betting round or when your opponent checks. I'm not going to go through all the spots to overbet today. Check that out at pokercoaching.com. We have a full section on that, and both the Tournament Masterclass, Cash Game Masterclass, and even more exploitatively in the Advanced Tournament course and Advanced Cash Game course. Anyway, that's how to figure out if you should call more often. Notice here, this is what you should call within GTO world. Well, I just closed it, my bad. But remember, you were calling, what was it, Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 offsuit, stuff like that. Lots of ace-x. So you would call wider than GTO if your opponent is not shoving adequately. Remember, we had our opponent shoving way too wide. Okay? Always take advantage of what your opponents do incorrectly. Let's take a look at another spot. Let's say you raise from the low jack with a tighter range. Let's say folds around to the big. You raise low jack, folds around to the big blind. Oh my God, I'm clicking the wrong button. Folds around to the big blind who calls like this. Notice here, the big blind should not be shoving very often for 20 big blinds. We're 20 big blinds deep now. 20 big blinds deep. You raise the low jack, big blind calls. By the way, most people fold too often here. Most people don't call the 6-3, 5-3, 4-3, 8-5, Queen 4. They just fold all these. Also, a lot of people don't shove often enough, or sometimes people shove too often. Always consider what that does to their range. I have a question. Say your big blind calls, and the flop comes ace 9, ace 10, 5. They check. This is a spot where you should be betting very frequently, right? What happens if instead, pre-flop, they go all in with all their ace-x? How would that change your strategy? I think, could be wrong about this, you should be betting bigger. Say it comes ace 10, 5. Notice you're already betting everything. But essentially now, your advantage is going to be much bigger in this spot. Notice you're already betting pretty big with a lot of your ace-x. But because you have a lot of ace-x and they have none, you have a humongous effective nut advantage, which allows you to apply a lot of pressure. So again, just consider what your opponents do. I know someone earlier said my opponent goes all in with every ace-x and pair, right? So going back to considering how you would adjust. Anyway, let's say you raise your big blind calls on the flop. Big blind is in bad shape. They check. This equity is wrong here, I think. In this spot, you're going to bet everything. Say you do bet everything using a medium size or small. Notice you're using a big size a lot just because your range has a lot of ace-x proportionally. Say you bet. They call. Notice they should be folding a lot against a big bet. Why should they be folding a lot against a big bet? Well, because they're running into a really strong range and because they have a whole lot of garbage. They're folding 71% of the time. That's a ton. Say they do call, though. Take a look at what should call. Why bet everything if they are unlikely to hit? Because you have a range advantage, an equity advantage, and a nut advantage. When you are favored, you put money in the pot. That's just how poker works. When you're favored, you put money in the pot. When you're not favored, you don't put money in the pot. Like right here. Big blind's not favored. They do a lot of folding. They're especially not favored against a big bet. Big, 3.3 big blinds only. They should do a lot of folding. Now, consider exploits real quick. I think most people play about like this against a big bet. Maybe they don't raise quite often enough with the bottom pair, but they're not really screwing up against this. Take a look at how they should play against a small bet, though. Now they got to stick around a little bit more often. That said, I do still think a lot of people overfold in this spot, especially with these low junkers, and I definitely think they don't raise often enough. So these are all spots where I think people misplay. All right, now they're folding 62%, just because this board's really, really, really good for low jack and really, really, really bad for big blind. Anyway, say we bet big, they call, and let's say the turn is a, I don't know, 6. They check. Notice they have some leads. Notice now we don't get to bet everything on the turn. Why do we not get to bet everything on the turn despite having a really, really big nut advantage here with all the good ace-x? Remember, we have all the good ace-x here. We still don't get to blast it every time. Why? Because when we bet big on the flop and they folded 70% of their range is now quite strong. So when we are betting, we're betting very polarized. Our best made hands and some quote-unquote draws. But notice here our draws are real junkers. King 9, King 8, King 7, Queen 9, Queen 8, Jack 9, Jack 8, right? We don't have a whole lot of logical bluffs, and we don't want to bet a hand like King Queen and get raised. Do you have a practical approach to simplifying frequencies? Yes. Use implementable strategies. Recognize it's fine to just bet ace king and ace queen and ace jack big every time. Maybe you want to bet smaller with the ace 8 suited and ace 7 suited, right? That's typically how I do it. I just bet big with the best ones and bet smaller with the weaker ones most of the time. That's probably going to be fine. But yeah, you gotta realize that either you need to simplify the strategies to use only one bet size, which is often not ideal, or mix it up, right? Anyway, here if you do bet the turn big, and your opponent does stick around, well, now their range is really good going to the river. Notice they should raise a lot because they're close to all in. Say they do call, though. River's, let's say, a 2 of hearts. They're going to check everything. Notice we have almost no money left. We bet our last 7 with some bluffs still. But recognize we're not bluffing every single time, even though we have lots of good ace-x, which is definitely good enough to value bet. Right? Always recognize what your bets do to your opponent's ranges and adjust accordingly. So anyway, that is how you run deep in poker tournaments. You have to accumulate chips while also minimizing risk, especially on the turn in the river, like in this spot. If we did play this hand using this line, I would not bluff this river very often at all. I would take all of these bluffs, or the majority of these bluffs, and just not bluff them. I may also not shove my thinnest value bets. My thinnest value bets here are what? Ace-X, right? The weakest ace-X. So the weakest ace-X may want to check it in this spot, even though they don't have a whole lot of better hands. They have a few, but not a lot. The reason, by the way, your ace-8 can just very happily shove because they don't really have a whole lot of better hands, right? Notice also when you go all in for this last bit, they got to call off like any pair a lot of the time. And a lot of people will not do that. They'll just fold. Do you ever review subscriber hands? We do not do that currently. We did that in the past, but we found that it wasn't all that popular. If you all want me to review subscriber hands, though, hey, that'd be easy for me, especially in the morning. Send an email with a hand. If we get some number of hands, maybe we'll do it in the future. You need to accumulate chips while also minimizing risk. And like right here, this is a spot where if I did bet the turn and got called, I would not bluff the river nearly as often as GTO recommends. What is bluffing? All these hands. Because I think you're going to get called too often. And all the bluffs make no money. So always consider that and adjust accordingly, right? You want to accumulate chips while also minimizing risk. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's show. We actually have a cash game webinar later today on poker coaching. I'm going to be going through a bunch of hands that I recently played against all of you. Talking about hand reviews. I'm going to be reviewing a lot of the interesting hands that I played against you over the last month or so on Coin Poker. We've had a few meetup games there. If the next meetup game is when? I think it's March 30th. Yeah. Next meetup game is March 30th. You can check it out. Let me see. At poker coaching. This is a bad link. Pokercoaching.com/blog/coinpoker-monthly-leaderboard. If you have a question about the cash game leaderboard, send us an email and we will get you in that. Our students are in there battling hard, running it up, maybe running it down, who knows. And we have meetup games. So the next one will be on the 30th. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I played a bunch of hands against poker coaching members. And today at what time? My schedule is such a mess. Today at 4 p.m. Eastern time on poker coaching. For any poker coaching member, whether you're a free member or a paid member, you can get access into that for $0. Go to pokercoaching.com, sign up, and get in there. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Make the most of your opportunities. I'm excited for the webinar later today, only on pokercoaching.com. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Thanks to all of you for being here. Click the like button and subscribe button before we go. Also, check out the Poker Coaching Discord. Louis Philippe is having a study session right now. You can get in the study sessions by going to pokercoaching.com in the dashboard, click on community, and hop in there. Good luck. Run hot. Play better than your opponents. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.